Chapter 2. The Forming of the Triangle. To put it baldly and boldly, this book is a story of a scientist, a psychic and an aristocrat who were brought together in order to help bring mankind through a time of crisis. Though formed by widely different backgrounds and experiences, the lives of Andrea Paharich, Phyllis Virtue Schlemmer and Sir John Whitmore converged early in 1974 through a series of events so extraordinary that they could not but see them as a part of an organized plan. With but little demur they fell in with the plan, the fruition of which lies ahead of the time covered by this narrative, but to date the scientist has seriously damaged his reputation, the psychic has seen the collapse of her family life and former business interests, and the aristocrat has spent a substantial portion of his patrimony. So at first sight the story is one of an immense and presumptuous folly. Some would put it down to omnipotence fantasy or delusions of grandeur, and the possibility of casting two of the protagonists into the stereotypes of the deranged scientist and the prodigal heir to a distinguished lineage lends some plausibility to this view of the matter. But really it is too glib a view, which leaves too much out of account. If we must go in for psychological speculation, which we must if only because everyone else will, rather than accept the story at its face value it would, I think, be subtler and more apposite to think of these three not as seeking the satisfaction of exercising power but rather that of being exercised by it. The sense of being in service to a cause, of having a personal destiny bound up with the destiny of something greater and more significant than self, is surely an under-acknowledged component of the motivation of much extraordinary behavior. By any standard, the behavior of these three people has been extraordinary. Whether they were chosen or self-elected, guided or deluded into embracing their exacting and strange mission, may be moot points, but a point there can be no doubt about is that they have had the rare and heady satisfaction of believing themselves to have been recruited into service. By whom or what purpose they have served, could be questions of concern to all of us. Phyllis's parents were hoteliers in Pennsylvania, and they entrusted her upbringing up to the age of 12, when she went into a convent school, to her grandparents, who were Irish on her father's side and Italian on her mother's. She lived mainly with her Irish grandparents, the Virtues, but spent the summers on her Italian grandparents' grape farm. Both of her grandmothers, she says, were psychic, and her Italian grandmother was also a medium, and she recalls vividly the experience that, considered retrospectively, was the beginning of her own mediumship. She was 5 years old when her Irish grandfather, Thomas Virtue, died in 1934. He had 11 children, most of them daughters, and when he was dying the family came home from all over the world. In the middle of one night, Phyllis recalls, she was awakened and taken down to her grandfather's bedroom to say goodbye to him. Everyone in the room was weeping and mourning, and when she went in she wondered what was going on because she could see her grandfather standing beside the bed. On the bed was a big doll that looked like him, and she couldn't understand why they were all crying and what they were doing with the big doll. "You must feel Grandpa's feet, then you'll know he's gone to God," said her aunt, and she was lifted up to touch the ice-cold feet of the doll and to kiss its cheek, and she was puzzled because all the time there was the living form of her grandfather standing beside the bed. As not all members of the family had been able to get home in time, the corpse was laid out in a downstairs room for 4 or 5 days before the funeral. In the middle of the night, Phyllis would get up and go to the room and try to lift the doll out of its box, and she would talk to her grandfather, whom she frequently met wandering around the house. The family thought that she was undergoing a traumatic experience and refusing to accept her grandfather's death, and on the day of the funeral she was not allowed to go to the cemetery or to the mass. "I remember distinctly the day of his funeral," she says. "I was out playing hopscotch, and he was playing hopscotch with me. I thought this really great, because he'd never been able to play hopscotch before because his legs hurt. And I remember when they were bringing the coffin out my Uncle Tom picked me up and moved me off the sidewalk, and I said to my grandfather, 'Don't you want to go with the big doll?' And he said no, it was okay minus." Her family didn't allow Phyllis to talk to her grandmother until the day after the funeral, for they felt that Grandma Virtue had enough to cope with emotionally and shouldn't be further distressed by the child's seemingly wild talk. But when Phyllis did finally talk to her and told her that Grandpa wasn't dead but was right there with them, her grandmother, she says, immediately recognized what was going on. She considers that she was fortunate, on this as on later occasions, to have someone to reassure her that what she experienced was at least a known phenomenon if not a common one. At the convent she was made to feel guilty for professing to see auras and spirits, and she had one experience that made her withdrawn and fearful of her own apparent powers. She had a quarrel with a nun and in anger told her that God would punish her, and the evening of the same day the nun had a seizure as she was going into church, collapsing and foaming at the mouth. If she could do such things to people, Phyllis felt, those who said she was a witch and evil must be right, and it wasn't until some years later that she confessed her fears and their cause to the Mother Superior, who told her that the nun was an epileptic and it was no doubt just an unfortunate coincidence that her seizure at the entrance to the church had occurred after their quarrel. Phyllis had to learn to live with her faculties of paranormal perception, and there were times when it was not easy. Throughout childhood and adolescence she was very much of a solitary. She could not conceive of devoting her life and abilities to the service of the church, though she was at tin put under strong pressure to do so, for there were those her family who believed that if with her endowment she not serve God through his church she must perforce save the devil. She did in fact on occasion serve the church in unofficial capacity, by accompanying priests who performed exorcisms. She recalls one particular priest who, when she was a college sophomore, she accompanied on several official exorcisms, and who after solemnly performing the rites, would turn to her and say, "Has it gone, Phyllis?" At college she studied science subjects because she wanted to be a doctor, but she left before graduating in order to marry. 4 years of domesticity, she had 2 children, business, she and her husband owned 3 restaurants, load, but when she was 24 the marriage broke down and she took the children to Miami, where, starting from scratch and after some arduous years, she gradually built up her business interests and her reputation as a psychic. One of her businesses was a salvage company, and it prospered so rapidly because of her ability to locate sunken vessels psychically that a rival sabotaged their salvage boat. For the sake of the growing children, she moved from Miami to Orlando, Florida. She also married again, and husband, Norman Sclemmer, helped with her business interests. As a psychic, she was engaged by many corporations and also did medical diagnostic work. She assisted police, mining companies. She once psychically located coal in Ohio and had a successful television series, but her main interest and occupation was her work at the Psychic Center of Florida. The center, which Phyllis established, was a school for the development of psychic faculties, and her courses soon be booked to capacity. In January 1974, a young man who for the purposes of the narrative will be known as Bobby Horn started attending course at the school. Bobby, a short-order cook from Daytona Beach, some 60 miles from Orlando, had come to Phyllis's attention some 2 months before, when she had been prevailed upon to go to his home to try to put a stop to some poltergeist-type events that had been happening there. She had apparently been successful, and some days later she had received a call from Bobby begging her to let him join one of her psychic development classes. She had told him he couldn't join before January, thinking that his enthusiasm might wane before then, but promptly on the first day of the New Year's first session Bobby turned up for class. He had only been attending for 2 or 3 weeks when he became the central figure of attention, for things began happening around him. Phyllis says that she first realized that Bobby had ability as a psychic healer when she saw the healing aura around him. He was sitting in class next to a woman who was due to have an operation for an eardrum perforation which made her completely deaf on one side. On Phyllis's instructions, Bobby attempted a laying on of hands type of healing, and within 2 days the woman's hearing was restored. Another class member had a diabetic ulcer, which was disposed of within 4 days of Bobby's treating it. Paranormal healing was not a novel phenomenon in Phyllis's experience, but Bobby's abilities profoundly impressed her. She was even more impressed when, on February 21, Bobby came to her with a story and evidence of a healing he had performed out of class. A friend of his named Reg, who was a welder in a workshop near his home in Daytona Beach, had come to him 2 days before and asked him to drive him to hospital. He had had an accident at work with an acetylene torch and had suffered a 3rd-degree burn on the underside of his right arm. He had covered the burn with grease, but he was in great pain and needed treatment. When Reg appeared at his house, Bobby was outside taking photographs of his children, and when he saw Reg's burn he wondered whether his newfound healing abilities might be effective on it. Reg just wanted to be taken to hospital, but Bobby persuaded him to let him try just at least to reduce the pain by laying his hands over the burn for a few minutes. As his loaded camera was to hand, Bobby took some pictures of the burn before he attempted the healing. For about 8 minutes he held his hands over the burn, and when he removed them, to his own astonishment as well as Reg's, the arm was completely healed. Instead of grease and charred flesh, there was clear and intact new skin which was distinguishable from the surrounding skin only because there were no hairs on it. Bobby took some more pictures, and a couple of days later went to Phyllis with his amazing story and photographic evidence. Phyllis checked Bobby's account of what had happened with his wife and with the Healy, who both substantiated it. She was personally sufficiently satisfied that the story and the pictures were authentic that she decided this was a case worthy of the attention of the famed investigator of the outstanding healers and psychics of the age, Dr. Andrea Paharich, whom she had met at a conference some years before and on a number of occasions since. To judge from his own accounts, Andrea Paharich must have seen more miracles, and a greater variety of them, than any living man in our Western culture. To hear him talk about them, in his gentle, unemphatic, matter-of-fact way, is to experience an unnerving distortion of one's sense of reality. Short of stature but powerfully built and barrel-chested, with a shock of thick graying hair and a bristly gray-black mustache that curls up at its extremities, he looks like a gnomic Einstein. He is professorial and dry and wears half-moon spectacles when he is lecturing from notes, and many audiences who have heard him speak in recent years have experienced the difficulty of reconciling his manner and appearance with the way-out content of his talk. His academic and career credentials as a scientist are impeccable. He has been prolific of invention and innovation in the fields of medical electronics, neurophysiology, biocybernetics, ESP research, and holds 56 U.S. and foreign patents for his inventions. Such work could only have been accomplished by a man who was scientifically scrupulous, patient, diligent, and attentive to detail. But aside from his orthodox scientific work, Andrea Paharich has, over a period of 30 years, applied his scientific expertise to a study of parapsychological and paraphysical phenomena which has involved him in close cooperation with and observation of some of the most gifted psychics of the period. Eileen Garrett, Peter Hurkos, Harry Stone, Arrigo, and Uri Geller comprise, as anyone familiar with the literature of parapsychological research will know, a formidable group, and that one man should have worked with all of them is itself remarkable. No pattern of life experiences could more thoroughly have prepared a man to take prodigies in his stride and to accept a role as nuncio and intermediary in man's cosmic connection. It almost appears contrived, like a planned process of gradual initiation, a process of gentle persuasion leading by degrees from the improbable to the imponderable. His work with Mrs. Garrett and Peter Hurkos was in the comparatively respectable area of ESP research, studies of paranormal mental faculties such as telepathy and clairvoyance. With the Indian scholar, Dr. Finid, whom he says he met by chance in New York in 1951, he had his first experiences of the physical phenomena of mediumship such as materializations, and also through him obtained his first intimations of the existence of non-human intelligences. Then in 1963 he was in Brazil on a mission connected with the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Agency, and again quite by accident he heard about the phenomenal psychic surgeon José Pedro de Freitas, known as Arrigo, who with any rusty old knife and no anesthetics or sutures would perform in rapid succession a series of operations each of which an entire hospital team would normally take 20 times as long to perform. Paharich paid several visits to Brazil to study and film Arrigo in action, and it was during these visits, he says, that he first became aware of UFOs, and actually photographed some. Shortly after Arrigo's death in an automobile accident in 1971, Paharich heard about Uri Geller and went to Israel to meet him. He later brought Geller to Europe and the United States for investigation by scientists, and he reports having witnessed phenomena that make the famed spoon and key bending feats look like child's play, such as Geller's being teleported in a flash from East 57th Street in New York City to the veranda of the Ossining House. Depending on your point of view, Paharich's career as a psychic investigator may look like a process of preparation for his extraordinary ambassadorship or one of gradual decline of sense and judgment. One fact that may favor the former view is that the motif of the cosmic connection has come through apparently independently of Paharich in several of his investigations of these remarkable psychics. Geller hypothesized that his powers had been invested in him by extraterrestrials, and that as a child while playing in a garden he had been struck unconscious by a blinding ray of light emitted from the head of an immense figure that had appeared to almost any other psychic investigator but Paharich. Such a claim would have seemed preposterous, but by the time he met Uri, Paharich had had some experiences of UFOs and had bid some communications with an alleged cosmic intelligence through the mediumship of Dr. Vinod. In 1952, Dr. Finnett had channeled a series of strange communications full of complex scientific and mathematical concepts which purported to come from the Nine. On a visit to Purich's research laboratory in Maine, this Indian sage and psychic went into a trance and suddenly started speaking in a voice totally different from his own. The communications began, "I'm calling. We are 9 principles and forces, personalities if you will, working in complete mutual implication. We are forces, and the nature of our work is to accentuate the positive, the evolutional, and the teleological aspects of existence. We propose to work with you addressed to Paharich in some essential respects. We want to begin altogether at a different dimension, though it is true that your work has itself led up to this. We have designed to utilize you and thus to fulfill you. Peace is a process and will be revealed only progressively. You have in plenty the patience which is so deeply needed in this magnificent adventure. But today, at the moment of our advent, the most eventful and spectacular phase of your work begins." These communications, which were never published, continued for many months but terminated when the attendant group split up and Dr. Finnett returned to his home in India. That was nearly 20 years before Paharich met Geller and 22 years before regular communications with the Nine were resumed, and in the interim Purich's research work did indeed become increasingly spectacular, though some who would use the word would intend it pejoratively. Meanwhile, he continued his more orthodox scientific work and consolidated a reputation as an innovator in electronic medical technology, thus maintaining the respect of his scientific peers despite his eccentric excursions into the dubious peripheries of the paranormal. But through his involvement with Geller and the publication of his book on him in 1974, he went right out on a limb, apparently deserting science for science fiction, declaring publicly that he and Uri had been in direct contact with an extraterrestrial civilization and were the appointed harbingers of a forthcoming mass landing of UFOs on Earth. The message, however, didn't get across, even though Uri became internationally celebrated for his psychokinetic feats. If it was a PR operation by extraterrestrials, the Geller episode was misconceived and mismanaged, for people failed to see the connection between paranormally bent cutlery, space beings and the role of man and the planet Earth in the cosmic scheme. Paharich arranged for Geller to be investigated by reputable scientists, such as the physicists Harold Pothoff and Russell Targ of the Stanford Research Institute, both in Europe and America, and though a number of distinguished men were impressed and prepared to attest to Geller's paranormal powers, they were understandably skeptical about his claims as to whence those powers derived. Geller became disillusioned and headstrong, and in 1974 he and Paharich went their separate ways. The cosmic connection, it seemed, had been severed.